Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Tech Tuesday with me, David, over here at OM System. I hope you're all happy, healthy, wherever you are in the world. Don't forget, throughout this session, you can drop into the comment section and give me a little wave. Let me know who you are, where you're at. And of course, because it is a Tech Tuesday, we will have some subject matters to talk about, but you can ask any of your technical questions in there as well. And I'll do my very best to answer them. We're doing this about every once a month now, so hopefully you'll have lots of questions built up that we perhaps haven't answered in different sessions since the last time we did a Tech Tuesday. But definitely put some questions in there for the comments for me. I'll do my best to both give you a shout out and answer those tech questions, but please don't be upset if I don't see every single one of them as we go through. We've got a limited amount of time today, so we're here for about 45 minutes to an hour. And of course, if you're enjoying whatever you see here, please do share the feed as well. If you're on Facebook, it's nice and easy to click share. You can share to any of the groups that you're part of. Other photographers want to come and watch. And if you're on YouTube, give us all a thumbs up and things like that. So what are we here to look at today? Well, we are going to literally focus on the 60mm and 30mm macro lenses. That's what we're going to have a chat about today. And we've done a couple of these focus on lens sessions before where we kind of dig into the ins and outs of the lenses. And it's a bit of a nerd out, really. It's looking at the specifications of those lenses, how they kind of work, what extra bits and pieces they've got on them and what they're good for. So I'll go over a few things about those lenses in some slides. We'll talk a little bit about coatings, and then I want to do a little demonstration for you just before the end of the session, which will hopefully display how important it is to remember, or if you don't already know about it, to learn about things like diffraction. Because diffraction is a massive part of everybody's photography, and we need to make sure that we're not making diffraction worse by ignoring the factors that affect it. So we'll have a little look at that towards the end of the session as well. Let's just have a quick look. And obviously, if none of you can hear me, I've waffled on for about 3 or 4 minutes already. And if there's a problem with my audio, then you guys definitely need to let me know. So I'm just going to skim to the bottom of the comments, make sure nobody's shouting at me to say the audio isn't coming through. It seems fine. Let's quickly say some hellos, because I do like to mention people before we get into the techie stuff. There were a couple of comments that came into the stream before we went live. It was from Paul. Paul's got the Olympus 60mm. Let's put Paul's comment up on here. And it is impressively sharp. I agree. I probably use the 60mm macro lens by Olympus the most in all of my photography. I would say that I am sort of 70%, 80% a macro photographer, and that is my favorite lens. And not only can it be used for macro, it can be used for portraits and other things, but all-round sharpness in that lens is absolutely phenomenal. Now, it is a challenging lens to first use if you've not A, used a macro lens, or B, used anything with focus limiters on. So it can be a challenge, but I absolutely recommend sticking with it and practicing. And practice makes improvement. That's just genuinely the way it goes forward. Practice does make improvement. And that 60mm macro lens is definitely a good example of where that comes into play. So, Paul, glad you've got that. It is a one-to-one reproduction lens. We will come on to that more a little bit later on. Hi, Barry. Barry's in a cloudy wear. It's a bit rubbish, the weather in the UK at the moment as well. April showers, unfortunately. Wherever you are in the world, let me know what you've got. Hot, cold, snow, ice, let us know. Of course, your cameras can deal with it all. They're absolutely fine out there in those weathers. Keith's got a 100 to 400 by the looks of a previous comment coming today, so I hope you have fun with that, Keith. Lots of people saying hello. Ashley in South Australia. We've got Michelle in, I think, is that Lehigh Valley? I hope I'm saying that right, in PA. We've got Elaine Kramer in Kent. We've got HE from the sunny Netherlands. Loads of people, loads and loads of people. So I'm sorry if I don't manage to shout out the highs as I'm going through, because I have to try and balance our lovely community aspect with the technical aspects of what we're talking about today. So again, if you see me kind of looking over here, I'm just quickly scanning comments for anything that might be going wrong with the stream, because it is just me. I'm on my own here, one-man band. So if anything goes wrong, I've only got your eyes and ears to let me know. So let's quickly just have a quick scan. Before I sort of dive into some slides, I'm going to have a look at some of the questions that have come through already. And if they're not ones that I've planned throughout the session, we'll answer those quickly, and then we'll go on to look at some other things. Let's look. John Davies has asked a very valid question. asking if you can add a 2x converter to these lenses. So no, there's no official connection point for 2x or 1.4x converter to these lenses. However, unofficially it has been done. This is not something that's a massive secret. There are people that have attached 2x converters in various different ways to these lenses. It's not something that as a company we recommend, of course, because it's not how they were intended to be used. So if any damage occurs when you're trying to do this via the different ways that it can be done, then obviously bear in mind this is going to void your warranty with those products with us, because it comes under misuse. However, there's no denying that there are ways to attach 2x and 1.4x converters to these lenses. It's just not something that you'll be able to get me to tell you about. Officially, you can't attach them in any straight and direct manner. Okay, you can all read between the lines quite happily there. Victor from Israel, beautiful dog on your image just there. Hi Victor, thanks for dropping it. Let's have a quick look as well. Let's see, this is an interesting question coming from Andrew. So Andrew, I'm going to read this. It kind of goes off the screen a little bit there, but Andrew's question is that when doing focus stacking in the camera, if you're shooting RAW only, the JPEG is 1260. But by shooting RAW and JPEG, the JPEG is the same setting. Is there a way around this? Yeah, so you can just alter the JPEG set. You should be able to just alter the JPEG setting in your menu settings to be the full size JPEG. It shouldn't be coming out any smaller. Oh, sorry, no, actually, if I'm reading this correctly, we're referring to the final cropped focus stack. Andrew, just clarify which JPEG you're referencing when you talk about 1260. Tell me which one you're querying, because when you do focus stacking in camera, the camera records whether you like it or not, RAW plus JPEG in the sequence, and then gives you a final JPEG which is cropped. Just let me know which one you're talking about. Okay, so Steve Hewitt, hello. Carolyn Peter Archdale, hello. Good to see you. David in the UK, hello. I've got to find someone that's not in the UK. Come on, who have we got? Jack's in Canada on a beautiful day. Hello, Jack. Thanks for dropping in. Lots of other people as well. Let's look at let's look at some slides. Let's start talking about these lenses. So hopefully the one-man band can try and do this as smoothly as possible. Oops, not that smoothly apparently. You all know me enough by now to know that that's not an accidental mistake. Okay. So let's look at these two lenses. There they are, lined up, and these two, and they're as you see them there, they are the size that they should be in real life in comparison to each other. So you can see the size difference that we've got there between the 60mm macro there on the left and the 30mm macro on the right. Let's have a look first of all at the specifications of the 60mm macro. So of course, if you've been in Micro Four Thirds for some time or just joined, you may or may not know that whatever we talk about in terms of focal lengths on our Micro Four Thirds lenses has a field of view crop equivalent of double that for what we would see in a 35mm system. So a 60mm is 120mm field of view crop equivalent. Okay, so that's what we're seeing there. This 60mm macro has a maximum aperture of f2.8, which is great. Loads of light in as you need it, and really, really helpful for when you want to perhaps use this lens as a portrait lens as well. If you really want to isolate that subject, get some lovely background blur, or perhaps some interesting kind of bokeh in the specular highlights that you might have going on back there. Interestingly enough, which I haven't written into these slides, is that the bokeh on your specular highlights, on your light sources in the background for the 60mm macro, what you'll find is that despite it being a circular aperture diaphragm system, the bokeh is actually hexagonal shaped. So you get these really lovely kind of sharp edges in that kind of bokeh. So if you're shooting a macro and there's some dew glinting in the background and that really lovely out of focus effect comes into play, then that bokeh is going to be lovely sort of hexagonal shapes. So you got a maximum aperture of f2.8, and like most but not all of the OM system and Olympus lenses, you've got a minimum aperture of f22. Now, really, really important to think about that f22, because it's going to really come into play later on in this session when I talk to you about diffraction and how important it is to not overuse the more minimum apertures in terms of getting extra depth of field. So obviously, we talk about things like maximum apertures or wide open apertures giving very shallow depth of field, even more so when it comes to macro lenses, because that depth of field is so compressed, you might be looking at only a couple of millimeters in focus. So what we can sometimes try and do is stop that aperture down towards the larger f number to try and create more depth of field. And some people can be tempted to go all the way to f22 to really put that in there, but there are reasons why. Some of you will know, and some of you will be now curious, and I'll hopefully be able to show you a demonstration of why we need to bear that kind of information in mind and where we need to draw a line in the sand before stepping over any particular f numbers. So this beautiful lens has 13 elements, 13 optical elements in 10 groups. Okay, so the groups are where the elements are fixed together. You have one ED lens, one extra low dispersion lens, two high refractive lens, and one extra high or super high refraction lens in there as well. So high refraction indexes are really important when it comes to getting nice sharp images. And I've got a little bit more information about that as we go through the slides. It is a 1 times magnification macro lens, which means it can reproduce 1:1 ratio. That means whatever you're shooting, if you fix this lens at its 1:1 shooting ratio, you can reproduce that subject matter life size as it would be if you physically placed it on the sensor. So your sensor is about 17 millimeters across. And if you were shooting 17 millimeters on a ruler at 1:1, the whole 17 millimeters would fill your entire compositional frame, which is something that I think, if I remember rightly, seeing at the top of our comments here, is something that Paul said. So Paul mentioned that right at the start. If your subject is 17 millimeters across, it will fill your frame completely, which is loads of fun. And then, of course, it's dust-proof, splash-proof. It's an IPX1 rated lens. Which means that it matches with your weather sealed bodies. So your EM5 Mark III, EM5 Mark II, pretty much any OMD other than EM10 and not Pen F, but it's all going to match up with your weather sealed bodies. Like I mentioned before, it has a circular aperture system, has 7 blades in there. Filter thread size 46 millimeters. So really important if you're thinking about using things like magnification add-ons like Raynox editions, that you'll need sort of step-up rings to work on that 46 millimeters. Of course, if you're going to use any sort of polarizing filters, etc. And really, really important if you are using the STF8 macro flash, because that comes with 2 step rings in order to clip the flashes onto, and one of them is a 46 millimeter to match this lens. Weighing in at a paltry 185 grams, it is a tiny little magical beauty. Wonderful, wonderful lens. We'll have a closer look at it later on. Whilst we're still in here, I'm just going to whip through questions in between our slides as well, so that hopefully we're looking at most of people's input. Sue is using the 60 millimeter for the underwater macro. Of course, you can get a port to match the underwater housing that fits with the 60 millimeter and the 30 millimeter, which we'll look at as well. Hi, Larry from Florida. Brilliant. Thanks for dropping in. Okay, so Howard, this is a great question. Howard's asked, we're talking about something other than macro now. Do I need target mode all with birds in flight using the 100 to 400? Well, if you've got birds in flight against the sky, it's a really good idea and a really easy idea to use target mode all AF points in conjunction with the AF clustering, which is where all the little kind of AF points will dance around to match the subject in the sky. And that works really well against plain backgrounds. So definitely, if you're using AF clustering, use all target points. If you're not using AF cluster, use a smaller, more precise point, and the smaller the better, whatever you're confident with. So it might be a 9 cross, or if you're really confident, a single point, but with birds in flight, that might be pushing it a little bit for the old eye. Thanks for a great question, Howard. Okay, so Mark's over in Suffolk in the UK. Hi, Mark, you're down towards the south of us, and you've got the 30 millimeter macro. It's a fantastic lens and really, really useful for lots of different things. That one as well. Okay, we'll go through some more questions in just a second. Let's see if I can move the slide along. Let's talk about some of the features of the 60 millimeter macro. It's a pretty phenomenal lens in terms of what it's got going on. You know, from the outside, it's a macro lens, and we think, yeah, macro lenses are great because they focus super close. And of course, this one's a tiny little thing, so it's really, really easy to use. But there's a lot going on inside. So the 60mm has a floating inner focusing system, which is 3 drive systems as well. So it's all kind of going on, all floating around in there. And you can see there from that top diagram that you've got those 3 groups inside that are floating around, and they come together in a really cool way to give us that one-to-one magnification reproduction. And we've got a little diagram to show you on a slide in a second. You've also got these lens groups inside that have got these coatings. So you've got ED, which is extra low dispersion. Okay, that's to prevent things like flaring and things like that. High refractive index, HR elements in there as well. And EHR, which is extra high refractive or super refractive, super high refractive index elements. And they're all basically designed to give you cleaner and clearer images by focusing the light better and reducing chromatic aberration and things like that. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And like many of the Zuiko lenses, we've got the 0 coating. So that's Zuiko extra low reflection optical coating, and that reduces the ghosting and flaring. As we've progressed through the technology, the newer lenses have the 0 coating, and they also have a nano coating as well, which is additional protection against ghosting and flaring for that as well. Always important to not forget that these lenses can be used with movie, and the 60mm has the MSC mechanism, which is the movie and stills compatible quiet AF focusing system. So that's really, really important as well. It runs on a linear motor. We'll leave it out for a second. People can have a little look at that. We've got Val waving from the Midwest. Hi, Val. I'm going to give you a little wave from Middle Earth here in Cambridgeshire. And we've also got Sheila in from Perth in Australia. Perth, brilliant stuff. We've got loads of customers in Perth. Fantastic. Good to see you in as well, Sheila. So let's see if we can find some questions. This is great to see as well. So I always do like to pull up comments that say, that talk about how good the information we're giving you is. So Jenny said that you've learned so much from the live sessions in the last 2 years, which is brilliant. That's something that we really, really like to hear, because obviously that keeps us kind of motivated to keep bringing you content like this. And also we are always open to any suggestions as to the type of content that you want. Now we can't promise to make all of it, but it's really, really great to hear what you have all got to say. Roberto has just bought the 60mm and always forget that you've set the limiter on. Yeah, it's really, really important to look at these things. We'll look at the limiter system in just a second, and I've done it as well. And I've been using this macro lens for 8 years, 9 years kind of thing. But we've all done it. Sarah, yes, this is going to be recorded. So depending on where you're watching on YouTube. So you can go back to YouTube later on and you'll be able to watch this entire session. If you've got to go somewhere, if you're going to miss it, you can come back and fill in the blanks. And of course, it'll be available on the 2 Facebook accounts that we have as well. Okay, let's go ahead and look at another slide. Let's look at, this is the focusing mechanism for one-to-one macro and infinity shooting. So if we look at the top diagram here, this is where the lens elements group to shoot at infinity, because the lens can be used as a portrait lens, as an anything lens. It can focus at infinity, providing you don't put any extension tubes on here. If you do decide that you're going to use extension tubes, then you will lose infinity focusing. The lens won't be able to focus on that mountain that's 50 kilometers away or anything like that. So just be aware, using extension tubes does lose the infinity focus ability, but without that you're going to get infinity focus by using the top end limiter option on this lens. And of course then the lower diagram is showing what happens to those lens focus groups, those lens element groups, when we're focusing at one-to-one, and we're bringing it all together to allow that lens to focus at its closest point. And there are 2 really important numbers here, and it depends how you like to measure your distances. I like to measure my distances from the front element on any lens, because I know where that is all the time. It's something that's easy for me to glance down and measure a distance from. However, on the lens itself, the focusing distances are written at a distance from the sensor plane. Now, the sensor plane is here. It's inside your camera, right there. And on the top of your camera, somewhere around the EVF hump, you will see a little icon that looks like a 0 with a line diagonally through it. And that represents where the sensor is inside your unit. And all of the measurements, so for example, the 60mm macro's closest focusing distance is listed on the lens, and with the content that comes with it at 0.19 meters. Okay, and that calculates to for me to 19 centimeters, and that means that the closest focusing point is 19 centimeters from that focal sensor plane in here. So it's 19 centimeters from there forwards to the subject. Conveniently, the 60mm macro is 10 centimeters, a little under 10 centimeters long, which means that you can actually calculate it in the way that I prefer to do, which is from the end of the lens, and that works out at 9 centimeters from the front element. And I'm fully aware that that's not a 60mm macro because that's over here on my demonstration camera. So you've got two ways to look at it. You can measure 0.19 meters or 19 centimeters from the sensor plane, which is on that little marking on your EVF hood, or you can measure 9 centimeters from the front element of the 60mm macro, and that's the closest point. The lens isn't going to focus any closer than that. So if you've got yourself into a position where you're using autofocus and trying to achieve one-to-one, which many people do, and is a really challenging and frustrating way to do it, you might find that the lens is hunting backwards and forwards all the time and never getting anything in focus. And that's usually when you're closer than 9 centimeters. On that note, my preference for using the 60mm macro at one-to-one is to have the camera and lens in manual focus and move myself or the subject, just because it's much easier to lock onto that specific focusing distance at one-to-one. So that's what your lens looks like inside when it's doing all those fancy things. We've got in Giles from Quebec, who says the 60mm is a tremendous lens. I agree. Cheers to that. We've got Festive Change from Ontario in Canada. And Mayland, good to see you as well. Mayland, another one of our fantastic Australian customers. Great to have you in the session as well. Okay, right, let's have a quick look through. Susie, I have to bring Susie's message up here. Pretty sure she's probably written it just to see if this will error reaction, but it actually won't. Susie says that she's a macro heathen and loves using the 40 to 150 2.8 at f4 and 150. And that's great. You're so right, Susie. That is a fantastic close-up lens. Not technically macro. No, if you were to get into a bar brawl with a macro purist, then they would be really unhappy about what you're doing there. Personally, I'm not that bothered. I think close-up is close-up, and macro can be whatever you perceive it to be. But on paper, yeah, it's not true macro, but it's exceptionally close. That 40 to 150 works really, really well. The 300mm f4 works really, really well. The 150 to 400, again, getting you those super close-up images without using a macro lens. And it does give you the ability to be a bit further away from your subjects, things like dragonflies and things like that. So no, you've absolutely got an amazing point there, Susie. Fantastic. Right, let's see. One more question and then we'll look at another slide here. This is great. It's not a question, but I'm going to pop it up. Colin's using the 60mm as a go-to lens for concert photography. Brilliant. Yeah, sneaking the camera into a gig because it's nice and little. And you've been practicing focus stacking with it on the garden, in the garden on Sunday too. Hopefully, if you had the same kind of weather that we had here on Sunday, it was pretty nice. So excellent. I'm glad it was a good time to have this session for you. So the question that I'm going to have before we move slides on this one is from David. Hi, David. Thanks for dropping in and thanks for your question. Your question is OM1 in-camera focus stacking, and you want to know what is frame-to-frame focal point sequence. Right, so let me think about this one. You know that the first frame is where you focus the subject, but then does it take 1 or 2 image steps closer to the lens? It takes 3 images closer towards you. So that's quite an interesting question. If you're focus stacking in camera, we need to set the initial focus area, whether that be manually or with autofocus, around a third to 40% into the depth of the image. Or of course, if there's an insect, focus on the eyes because there are things nearer towards you and further away. The camera is going to take an initial image. That's like a reference point because the whole thing is going to be cropped by about 7% afterwards. And then it's going to take 3 images closer towards you, nearer towards you, after it's taken that initial image. And then it hops behind that initial image, going towards infinity to release the rest of them. And if you want to experiment with that, I suggest getting a still life subject and utilizing a very slow shutter speed to physically see those jumps on the rear screen as to how that works in real life. A great question though, David. Thank you. Okay. So this is just a diagram to give you an idea of the protection that the 60mm lens has in terms of being dust and splash proof. And obviously these red areas are the gaskets in the lens where everything's sealed up. So you can see there the cross section through the middle. And of course, those rings in situ around that lens as well. So it's very well protected. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 initial gaskets around, and then 8, 9 further gaskets around the switch system. So lots of protection in there for your weather sealing. Now it comes to talk about the focus limiter switch on the side, because this can be the challenging thing for a lot of people, and it can be a little bit confusing if you've just started out in macro as well. You've got 5 different points to be looking at on here. The first point is the switch itself. So it is a small dial that can be clicked between 3 points, or it can be spring tension set to 1 point. So at the point there where you see the number 2 marking for the 1-to-1 ratio, when you turn the little dial to that, the dial is not going to stay there. It doesn't stay in that set position. All that does is it refocuses the lens groups, the element groups, to that close focusing position that you saw in an earlier slide. What that means is that at that point, if you're in manual focus, whenever you click and take that image, it's going to be set to focus on something at 9 centimeters from the front element, or 19 centimeters from the center plane. Now, if you're in autofocus, just because you've put it into 1-to-1 doesn't mean it's going to stay there, because if you're too far away, if you're further than 9 centimeters, then the lens will try and focus on whatever it can, and that will mean realigning those lens element groups to a point where it can focus, and that could be further away than 9 centimeters, which means that you're not actually then physically focusing at 1-to-1, because it's refocused at a longer distance. And that's what the indicator on the side for. And that's going to be our next slide to have a little look at. Now, I do hear of a lot of people holding that dial in the 1-to-1 position and using autofocus. I don't particularly recommend that, because it does put strain on the focusing system. If you want to absolutely only shoot at 1-to-1, the most precise way to do that is to turn that dial to the 1-to-1 position and set your camera and lens into manual focus only. That way, no matter how many half presses or AF presses that you make, it's not going to try and refocus outside of that 9 centimeter distance. And you can just kind of do that backwards and forwards movement until you hit that focal plane. I'll give you a little demonstration of that when we go over and do a live shot. Now, of course, if you just want to do something that's close up, then you can use AF, and you can turn the dial limiter to the 3 position on here. And the 3 position is 0.19, 9 centimeters from the end of the lens, or 0.4 meters, which would be 30 centimeters from the end of the lens. And it's giving you that small amount of leeway that AF can drift between. It's not going to hit on anything further away than the 30 centimeters from the end of the lens, and it's not going to hit anything nearer than the 9 centimeters, but it gives you a little leeway, and that's when autofocus is very, very usable. Just bear in mind that you can't be right on top of something, because if you're closer than 9 centimeters, it's just not going to focus. It's going to hunt, and you're going to get really frustrated. Then the option number 4 on here is 0.19 meters to infinity. That's the whole range. Excuse me. That is the whole range from the closest point to infinity. And then 0.4 to infinity, again, is just a little bit further away if you don't want it to lock onto something too close to you. So you can utilize those. And they're particularly useful when you're doing portraits and things like that. But it's important to familiarize yourself with how that AF limiter works. Really, really important. Let's have a quick look before we go across to the next slide. We've got Paul from St. Thomas, Ontario, Canada. Paul's also got the 60mm. Excellent. I think during the initial parts of lockdown, many people around the world did acquire this lens, because it was realistically the safest form of photography to take part in, because you could do it at home, you do it in your garden, or very close areas to your home without getting too close to other groups of people. Steve's always working. Catch up later on. It's all being recorded, so you can catch up on the whole session later on, Steve, but thanks for dropping in briefly in here as well. Okay, so Guillermo has said that the 60mm is awesome. Thank you. Yes, it is. Tips on focus stacking setup. So you're struggling a bit on the number of frames and where to focus. There are a huge amount of parameters involved when it comes to things like focus stacking, and that is how many images do you use, what aperture rating do you use for depth of field, and things like that, and the light, and all sorts of different things. But a good kind of general purpose setup, if you're going to do focus stacking in camera with the 60mm, is use f5.6, set yourself to 10 shots, and focus about 40% into the depth of the subject that you want to all be in focus, or if it's an insect, on the eyes. And that's, generally speaking, going to give you a relatively good output. And remember that if you are focus stacking in camera, that final image has a 7% crop. You do have a compositional frame pop up on almost all of the models to show you to keep inside this frame to get your image correct. But generally speaking, that kind of setup will give you a reasonable output for most things. Okay, so let's have a look at the next slide here. We'll come back to some more questions. So this is the indicator window. This is what is going to be your best friend in telling you where you are in terms of the focusing, the distance ratio, the reproduction ratio. So 1:1 being the most magnified, 1 to 1.3, 1 to 2, and 1 to 4 being less magnified, and also the distances at which you're reproducing those. And this little red bar inside will go up and down. If you're using autofocus, you'll be able to watch it zipping up and down depending on where it's grabbing that focus. Now, if you're at 1:1 in manual, you'll see that red line always at 1:1 at the top there at the 0.19 point. If you're in manual focus, that should never move unless you physically twist the dial. And as you twist the dial to focus on something further away, you'll see that red line coming down, heading towards the 1:4 ratio. And that's just signifying that you're getting less magnification and you're focusing further away. So if you're never quite sure where you're at or what reproduction ratio you've got, look at that little window on top, and it's going to be your best friend and tell you how to do that. And again, it's like anything else, practice makes improvement. So it's the more you use the limiter switch and the more you visualize that indicator window, the better it's going to become, and muscle memory builds up really, really quickly. Okay, so this is kind of slid over to, that's pretty much, and there's a lot going on with the 60mm macro. So I'm just going to go back one stage there. There's a huge amount going on with the 60mm macro, and you do need to spend quite a lot of time with it. But remembering basic principles such as that focusing distance as a minimum, using manual focus if you want 1:1. And also a really key thing is, even if you're using manual focus, don't forget to half press the shutter and hold a half press, because that's where all the stabilization comes in as well. So if you're not half pressing, you're going to get very wobbly stabilization before taking that shot, because you're magnifying everything massively. The smallest movements that the lens is seeing is going to be reproduced massively in your viewfinder, because it's a magnified view. So half press the front shutter, and that will initiate the full stabilization system, and it will really steady things out. And I'll give you a little demonstration of that as well. Okay, 30mm macro. This is a simple lens to use. It's so simple. There are no switches on it. There are no real rules about how to use it. It's got a superb minimum focusing distance of 1 centimeter, 10mm from that front element. And it just does it. It doesn't argue. You can do it in autofocus. It pretty much, the chances are that you will get so close to something that you'll block out all of your light before it can't focus. So the disadvantage to this is that it is a shorter crop. So this is a 30mm, which is a 60mm field of view. You will need to be closer to certain objects to reproduce a certain level of magnification. The maximum aperture on this one isn't as wide as the 60mm. It's an f3.5, but to be honest with you, in macro terms, you're still going to get really beautiful isolation in the background. You just lose that small amount of light. And of course, the minimum is still f22. Again, it's got 7 elements, but only 6 groups. For this one DSA lens, 1 EDA lens, and 1 aspherical lens. And it's a high-speed MSC imaging AF, so it's got that movie stills compatibility in there as well if you wanted to use it for macro video. Again, 7 blades in a circular aperture diaphragm, but the blades on this one won't give you that hexagonal bokeh on the specular highlights as you get from the 60mm macro. It's the same filter size, so if you're using the STF8 macro flash, you can use the same stepping ring to attach the flash heads to. It's still 46mm, and it weighs even less at 128 grams. So this is a really, really lightweight pocketable lens. And the difference with this lens, I would say, is that this is, whereas the 60mm may well be a fauna lens, this is absolutely a flora lens, because you can get right on top of something. And if that something's not bothered about you being on top of it, then it's absolutely fantastic. But definitely recommend using flash if you're going to be that close to something, because you can lose all of the natural light as you get that close. I'm just going to have a read of some more questions before we move on. So hopefully the questions versus what you're seeing is a nice balance here. Do let me know if it's a bit rubbish. I'll take all criticism well. Don't worry about it at all. Lots of people saying that the 60mm is an amazing portrait lens. Marilyn's jumped in there and said it's a great portrait lens. Malin saying it's one of the best Ollie lenses going and one of the first lenses. I mean, we've got to remember as well, it's not a new lens. It's been around for a number of years and it's still absolutely fantastic. So what do we got here? Tony, to get the one-to-one shot using manual focus, absolutely. Focusing rack, if you want to use a focusing rack, that's an option for you, depending on what level of macro you're getting into. And focus highlights, yeah. So we've got things like focus assistance, which we can have a little look at in our demo as well. So really, really good tips there, Tony. Let's have a quick look at this one here. Jenny's asked, how many images can I take when focus stacking with an M5 Mark III? Right, so the M5, the EM5 Mark III, the OMD, is limited in focus stacking. It is locked to 8 shots. So when you try and choose that option, it's actually grayed out because the camera is going to select 8 shots for you. Whereas on an EM1, you can choose between 3 and 15 shots. The EM5 Mark III is locked down to 8 shots only. So you don't have a choice. So if you're wondering why it's grayed out, it's perfectly normal. That's exactly why it will be. And Roberto, the final stacked photo is a JPEG with a 7% crop. If you want to get a much, much higher quality file, then you can utilize focus bracketing and stack that yourself in some sort of some third-party software. My preference is for things like Helicon Focus, which is a great piece of software with a free trial available if you're interested in having a go. Sue's got a great question. Will back button focus start the stabilization like a half press? Yes, but it will also effectively. So no, it's a more complicated matter. So if you're using manual focus and AF or back button focus is not linked to manual focus, then no. But when you're using autofocus, yes, the back button focus does initiate stabilization like a halfway press. But if you're only using manual focus, I suggest using the front button halfway to make sure it's absolutely on, because there is a slightly more complex way of setting the back button or AF on, as is now on the OM1, to act when manual focus is in play. David, any pro macros coming? Well, is the answer that I'm supposed to give you. I don't know. It's no, of course, we have in development on our roadmap, there is a macro lens. There are no official specifics as to whereabouts on that focal length it is, but there is one in development on that lens. You have to stay tuned. You have to not go anywhere. Keep your eyes on the official internet pages. Don't listen to these rumor sites, and we'll see what comes up. Thanks for your question, David. Oh, Jack's put a great question in there saying Photoshop does a great job when using focus bracketing. Get up to 99 images to then join up in Photoshop. You can. Bear in mind that lots of software can do an amount of focus bracketing and stack those images in. Once you get up to a certain number, there starts to be some problems with alignment and things like that. So if you're getting over a certain number, it is better to use software designed specifically for that job. So you've got things like Zareen Stacker, Helicon Focus, even some of the star stacking stuff can do a relatively good job. I will use more dedicated software when it comes to stacking 150, 200, 300 images together, because they really are geared up to that kind of alignment. But yeah, Jack, yeah, brilliant point. Absolutely. Yeah, Ronaldo Workspace will do stacking as well. There are so many cool things in Workspace. If you haven't had a look at it, make sure you update it to OM. Okay. Good. Oh, look at that. Time is flying. Let's get on with it. Features of the 30mm macro. This is really interesting because the 30mm macro, despite it being a shorter crop, actually magnifies greater level than the 60mm. So your 60mm is 1 times magnification, 1-to-1 ratio. Your 30mm can actually do a 1.25 times magnification on micro four thirds, which is actually 2.5 times 35 millimeter equivalent. So at maximum image replication, you're getting 2.5 times magnification. And then you've got obviously the DSA lenses, the ultra low dispersion lenses in there as well to give you that really, really magnificent resolution from the 30mm macro. And again, a really, really light lens that you're going to get that from. Beautiful, beautiful results. Here you can see you get this lovely circular bokeh from this lens rather than any hexagonal bokeh that you'll get on the 60mm lens. And of course, like the 60mm, it's compatible with focus bracketing and stacking in the relevant models as well. So just to give you an idea, really, this is a really nerdy bit about the lenses that we use in there. So we've got something called a DSA, which is a dual super aspherical lens. Okay. Now what happens with that one is that the lens is actually thinner in the middle than towards the edges. And what this does is it gives you really, really great resolution, but it also makes up for any potential chromatic aberration that may happen in the image. And that's what a DSA lens is specifically put in there for. We add on top of that the extra low dispersion aspherical lens. Okay, so that's about analyzing colors that come in through different wavelengths. Okay, so and it's about being able to focus on all those different wavelengths at the correct point. So that's what an extra low dispersion aspherical lens does, is it tries to bring all those wavelengths into the same focusing position to give you sharper images. And then you've got a super high refractive index lens as well, which again is about making sure that you get low levels of refraction as far through the aperture rating range as possible. And all those things adding together realistically are there to try and create super, super sharpness. Okay, so that is your kind of lens slideshow, so to speak. So let's come away from this. Excuse me. There's some great questions as well. If you'll excuse me for a second, I appear to have a very dry throat. Too much talking, not enough hydration. Right. So, oh, look at that. That was a a little bit of something stuck in there. Whilst my eyes are watering, why don't we go ahead and cross over to a camera view, and we can have a little look at some of the functionality within the macro lens. I've got the 60mm macro lens on here at the moment. It's a little bit dark, but we can resolve that. It's not a problem. That's just purely because of the settings that we've got linked in there. I have got a flash attached, which has made my ISO sit at ISO 200. And I'm shooting at 1/250th of a second because that's the fastest normal sync speed for flash. And I'm also going to be shooting at f5.6 for the best quality. And I'll show you this as we go through and the reasons why I shoot at f5.6. Now it is a bit dark. I'm shooting on an OM1, by the way, but these options are viable in an OMD as well. So first of all, because I'm shooting flash, I need to see what I'm doing, okay? Because I'm not using the ambient light, I'm not using the natural light. So let's first of all head into the menu, and we're going to switch on night vision, which is the same thing as live view boost from the previous OMD model. So I'm going to go menu, and we're going to go into the gear menu, and we're going to go into page 3 and night vision, and we're going to switch that on. And what that's going to do is it's going to brighten everything up for me so I can actually see what I'm doing. What I'm also going to do now is I'm going to turn the focus limiter switch on the side to 1:1. Okay, so I'm just going to give it one little click, and you can see there that that flower briefly came into focus and then went out of focus again. And that's because as the lens element groups passed through that particular focal plane, we could see the flower, but it's actually gone beyond that. So if I want this flower to be in focus now, I need to bring it closer to the lens. And we can see that the parts that come into focus are precisely 9 centimeters away now. This is a bit close for what I want to do, so I'm just going to move it back a little bit. We're going to move it out of focus. I'm in manual focus, so I'm going to use the focus ring on the lens to focus towards the area that I want. And whilst I'm doing that, I'm looking down at the indicator window at the top. I can see that red bar moving away from 1:1. As I get to the point that I want in focus, that's actually sitting just around the 1 to 1.3 area. So it's not true 1:1, but it's pretty close up. Now, sometimes it can be a bit difficult to see what's going on. So you might want to use one of the focus assistants. Now, in this one, we can go to the menu. We can go across to the AF tab. And in the AF tab, in page 6, we've got MF, or Manual Focus Assistance. And in there, you've got 3. You've got Magnify, Peaking, and Focus Indicator. Now, I tend to find Magnify a little bit too much in macro. It really kind of throws it in. It can throw it in up to 14 times magnification. You can bring that back to 3 times. So we'll give you an example real quickly, but I don't tend to use this too much. So what's going to happen is when I start to focus, there we go. You can see there that it's magnified and jumped right in. Now, the reason why we're seeing quite a low resolution image is one of 2 things. I'm actually seeing this through the night vision view that I've switched on, and I'm also connected via the HDMI cable as well. So we're seeing quite a noisy image in terms of that. Now it's zoomed into 10 times. If I stop focusing, it jumps back. So I'm going to start moving the focus ring again. And whilst doing that, let's just click the rear dial to lower the magnification to 3 times. There we go. So we can actually see a little bit more. Still a bit much for me, so I'm going to switch that off. I don't like that particular way of doing things. We'll switch that one off. And instead we'll switch peaking on, which is going to give us a nice colored shimmer around any of the areas that are in focus. If I now start to turn the focus ring, you'll just see a little glimmer of red. Now it's very faint, but what I can do is whilst I'm focusing backwards and forwards, I can press info and it brings up the peaking options for me. So I'm going to bring this into a high intensity. Now I can also change the contrast in the image. If I do this, depending on what color I've got, it will change it from a lighter or a darker contrast. We can change the color through black, white, yellow, and red. Let's put it in yellow and change the contrast, and it goes darker. So this is actually, for me, an easier way to see it. So I'm going to select OK on that one. And as I now move through, we can just see that very faint speckle of focus in there. Now, the more light you naturally have in the image, the brighter your focus peaking will be, because focus peaking does rely on contrast. Okay. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to focus on, there's sort of 3 or 4 little curled up petals in the middle, just at the top. I'm just going to focus on those just now. Okay. And I'm at f5.6. What I want to do is, as much as I'm just showing you that it's very, very easy to find that, you could be hand holding this. So let's imagine that we're hand holding it. So I'm going to rock my tripod backwards and forwards, and you can see there's definitely movement there. Now, in reference to what I said about half pressing the shutter, okay, I'm now going to half press the shutter and try and maintain that same movement. Here we go. So you can see that there's movement going on because it's still slightly shaking around the edges, but the majority of the image has now been stabilized. And I am really sort of pushing that around and shaking it. So this is something that you probably wouldn't experience out in the wild. But if I let go of the half press on the shutter again, you can see that that all comes back into play. And then I half press again, and it dulls down a huge amount of that movement. So that's why that half press is really, really important when you're handheld macro shooting. Now, we've got a few minutes left in the session. One of the really important things about this session that I wanted to go over was I wanted to talk about diffraction. And diffraction is something that happens when light waves push through optics in different ways, and they're focused in different ways. Ultimately, I want to try and steer you all away from using sort of larger apertures to get more depth of field. Okay, so we know that if we go sort of f13, f14, f16, f18, f20, f22, we're going to get more depth of field, because if I take a quick shot here at f2.8, let's take a quick shot, and then let's have a little playback of that one and see what we get. You can see in the image, such a narrow depth of field. You really have got, it's all out of focus here, and you've just got that central bit, and we can be too tempted to say, you know what, I'm going to just bring that aperture down to f16, f20, f22 even, to get that whole flower in. And the reason we don't do that is I'm going to take 2 shots now. I'm going to bring this to f5.6, which I personally consider the sharpest point on this macro lens. I'm just going to regain focus on these 4 little curled up petals in the middle, and I'm going to take that shot now. Oops, sorry, I've got my cable attached to the camera, which is why it's all shaking. There we go. That's an f5.6 shot, which we'll come and investigate in a second. Now we're going to bring this up to f22. I'm not going to change the focus. I'm just going to take another shot. And we're going to inspect the same point close up on both of these. So this is my f22 shot. Looks wonderful, doesn't it? All in focus. Look, we got most of those petals in focus. Fantastic. This is my f5.6 shot. Well, I didn't get all the petals in focus, but there's one major difference here. Let's look at this f22 shot. Let's zoom in to these petals here, which is what I looked at. This is your f22 shot that got the whole flower in focus. And then this is your f5.6 shot that didn't. But the clarity and quality between the two are night and day. The sharpness that we get from f5.6 is ultimately worlds above what we're getting at f22. So if you're not familiar with diffraction and how diffraction has a massive effect on your photography, let's just zoom back a little bit. And this is f22 and this is f5.6, and that sharpness will massively change throughout the range. And yes, f5.6 didn't get us the whole flower in focus, but we could use things like focus stacking to put many f5.6 images together rather than one f22 image, which has been softened by diffraction caused by that narrow aperture at f22. And this is on the 60mm macro. I just saw Kirsty's question there to say which macro lens are you using. That's on the 60mm macro. So do we want f22 and all in focus, or do we want f5.6, which ultimately has much greater detail in there? So if that is the only thing that many of you take from this session, it's a super important part of using any lenses, not just macro lenses. But the further we go away from those kind of sharpest points, and you can look at MTF charts to find out where the sharpest points are on most lenses. You'll find f5.6 on a lot of micro four thirds lenses is around about the sharpest anyway. But particularly for macro, don't be tempted to wind that aperture closer to the sort of f16, f20 kind of point, because you will experience that diffraction. In my mind, you shouldn't really try and go further than f8 in terms of maintaining quality, and then utilize things like focus stacking. Oh, Jonathan, that's a great question. While viewing zoomed in, how did I switch between the two images? Yeah, we'll show you that, no problem, before we have to bring the session to a close. So let's just come back. So this is our whole image. I zoom in with my rear dial, find where I want to look at with the up, down, left, right cursor keys around the OK button. And then to switch between the previous or the next image, I use the front dial. So that's next image, back again, front dial, click one forward and backwards with the front dial, just backwards and forwards like that, just to see a comparison between those two. And hopefully that answers your question, Jonathan. Okay. Dave, really glad you said that. Yeah, demonstrations really do show you what's going on. It's great to be able to talk to you about it. So it's great to be able to write an article about it. But when you're physically seeing this difference, and then I get so many emails every day, vast amounts of emails with very similar questions of why is this image soft? And at least 60 to 70% of those soft images can be explained through that phenomenon, which is just diffraction or refraction if we're talking about coming back the other way. Because remember, if you shoot wide open, you're also not going to hit the sharpest point as well. It's not going to be anywhere near as bad as f22, but you're going to experience a similar thing from refraction. Okay, so Stevens pops up an element in there. Shooting with a smaller f-stop is fine if you want to produce a sun star. Absolutely. So Stephen, I've seen Stephen's work, some absolutely beautiful landscape images that were, I believe, recently the inspiration for an excellent artist to paint as well. So fantastic. I saw that, Stephen. It was brilliant. But what Stephen's relating to is using things like f16 to produce sunbursts on points of light, things like light, the sun shining through trees or street lamps at night, things like that. So you can utilize that in such a way, and it's a means to an end, and it works really, really well. So yeah, thanks for dropping that in, Stephen. It's brilliant. Okay, everybody, our time has gone so quickly today, as it always does, and I wish I could answer all of your questions. But you know, you're just gonna have to hunt me down on social media somewhere. I will be back to do another Tech Tuesday in June. So yeah, so we're May now. We're going to be back in June. So keep an eye out for the Tech Tuesday. There's all sorts of other content coming through from the other members of the team. Keep an eye on our fantastic ambassadors. If you've got any problems at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to us or whoever's your regional OM system contact. You can get us on social media. You probably know where to reach out to most of us via email anyway. But if you've got any problems at all, we want to fix them for you. But for now, thanks so much for joining me, letting me waffle on to you for the best part of an hour. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's been educational, and I look forward to seeing you all again on the next one. Bye-bye, and take care for now.